So, as we've been exploring the groundwork for us to look at Deuteronomy, we've been looking at the nature of the covenant that God used to enter into relationship with Israel, the suzerainty vassal treaty. But also, I've mentioned that it was a law code. It was a system of law whereby Israel would be able to function as a nation. And often we can miss that when we read these law books, because what we can read is just a whole load of what may to us be burdensome rules and regulations, and it can help us to maybe shift our perspective, so when we read the different laws, we're able to connect to them as laws for a nation rather than what other perspective we may have. So I've spoken already about a lot of the laws are related to the way Israel should function in their religion. Now, of course, as new covenant believers, looking back at the different sacrificial systems and laws for the Day of Atonement and other things that you've explored, we know that these are pointing to the work that Jesus is going to do in his redemptive acts, in bringing about our forgiveness of our sins. And so there's always that sort of a wonderful dimension to this. But as we go back, if we were to go back in a time machine and we were to be there with the people, what we would be seeing is a system in place that is often a protection for Israel against idolatry. And a lot of the laws are related to that. As I mentioned earlier, Israel in Egypt were involved in a lot of pagan activities. They would have probably embraced a lot of the pagan worship, at least that's what we read as we continue in the Old Testament. And God was delivering them out of that paganism and bringing them into a place where they would worship the one true God. And so they needed a whole system of worship. And that is why there's such a lot of space given to the sacrificial system and lots of warnings against going into idolatry, which we will discover. And so we could have what we could call religious laws. But also there's laws that today we would call criminal laws. What should happen if someone steals something? What should the judicial system be like? How should the law courts work? What should happen if someone should murder someone else? How do you distinguish between murder and manslaughter? So we see different issues related to that. But then there's other laws that today we would probably call civil law. What to happen in a situation of divorce? What should happen in a situation that is not part of the culture of many of us, but what happens when you have two wives and the husband favours the one wife over the other? We find laws relating to those kind of things. We have laws that even today we would probably call public health or laws of hygiene. I'm not sure that they would have thought necessarily in those categories. But you remember that long chapter in Leviticus that talks about people with contagious skin disease. And there's details of how the priest should check that out. And if it is indeed contagious, those people are removed from the community. When it comes to talking about how to deal with dead animals that you may find in your cooking pot, for example, how that pot should not be used or should be thoroughly cleaned. We have these laws that today we would probably think of laws related to public health. Even how to deal with mildew in your house because of a problem of damp. We have these kind of laws. But then we have other laws that relate to safety. You remember how in Leviticus it says that if a man digs a hole, then they actually need to cover it up. because someone may fall in that hole, or an animal may fall in. And if they do, then the person who is doing that work is responsible for that particular action. And so we see laws related to that. There's a lot about economic laws. The economy of Israel is a fascinating study, because land, which is the means of production, or was the means of production, the means of wealth, that land was shared among all of the people. Unlike the Canaanites, where the king owned everything and maybe would let some of his rich underlords have land, this land was distributed among the people. And as I said, land was a means of wealth. You either farmed it, or you grazed it, or you mined it, or you got clay from it. You did different things, but that was how you lived. And that was given to all of the people, and land was not for sale. It was not a commercial entity. The most you could do was lease it. Another thing was the commercial loan was not allowed. There was no interest on a loan. If you gave a loan, it was to benefit the person you loaned to, so that they could get through a difficult time, and then they, of course, had to pay that back. And so there were economic laws. There were what today we might call social laws, laws to protect vulnerable members of society. And if you were really, really poor, there was a special tithe we read about in Deuteronomy 14, whereby produce was set aside in a storehouse in the towns, so that the widow, the orphan, the vulnerable, those who were not able to work were able to go and receive support and sustenance. When you were doing your reaping, you left portions of the field where you didn't reap it, or if you dropped some of your reaped corn, it was left there. And of course, the book of Ruth, which you will study, is a marvelous example of how these social laws worked out in practicality in the nation. And so we have laws like that. And then we have about how the nation should be governed, those who had authority. We will explore this more in Leviticus, when it talks about the judges and kings and priests and prophets, those that had responsibility and authority. Also about the military. The nation would be in the midst of other warfaring nations when they possessed the land. And they had a responsibility to protect themselves against those surrounding nations. And we even touch on things like arts and entertainment when we have this marvelous song of Moses at the end of Deuteronomy, which is so powerful. It talks about family and those family relationships and those connections as well. And so as you look at these different laws, I want to encourage you to not just see a random stipulation, but to be thinking about how would this work in society today? What kind of category would it come in? And for those of us here in Youth with a Mission, you'll know about the 7 spheres of influence. Those spheres which are in every society, whether it's primitive or complex. And it's these spheres that have influence in all different areas, that of family and religion, education, economics, business, government, media, and celebration. And it's can be a good practice to bear some of these categories in mind, and then it helps us not just look at a big block of law, but rather to be able to engage with each one and reflect on it. Firstly, what it meant in ancient society and how it benefited them. And then, as we're going to see in a subsequent lecture, how we can make that relevant for today. And so I just want to underline how God or Moses, God through Moses, emphasizes that the laws were always for the good of the people. Now he says this 3 times, at least in Deuteronomy. Chapter 4, verse 40. There he's talking about them, about his heart towards them, that how they should keep his statutes and his commandments. And we read there in verse 40, they are for your own well-being and for that of your descendants after you, so that you'll remain long in the land. You know, one of the final curses that we have in Deuteronomy 28, one of the final curses, the final discipline, is that they would lose the land. If they rebel against the covenant, they would lose the land. And what we read here is that these laws are given for their own well-being and their descendants after them. And as they obey them and keep them, they will remain long in the land. We can read also chapter 6, verse 24. Chapter 6, verse 24. Then the Lord commanded us to observe all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our lasting good, so as to keep us alive, as is now the case. These laws are for our lasting good. And then in chapter 10, verse 13. And to keep the commandments of the Lord your God and his decrees I'm commanding you today for your own well-being. You see, God who loved his people, God who cared for them, created a constitution, created a covenant, created a whole situation out of his love and care. That if Israel had obeyed him, they would have been a nation that would have been strong and prosperous and protected and safe and able to flourish. There's another very interesting passage here in Deuteronomy, back in chapter 4, when Moses is exhorting Israel to keep the law, and not to add anything or take anything away from it. And then we read this, chapter 4, verse 6. You must observe them diligently, that is the laws. You must observe them diligently, for this will show your wisdom and discernment to the peoples. In other words, the law of God was so good that the nations around would look and see the way Israel functions. And it would speak to the nations of the wisdom of the God of the nation of Israel. That when they hear of these statutes, the wisdom and discerning to the peoples who, when they hear all these statutes, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and discerning people. For what other great nation has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us whenever we call on him? And what other great nation has statutes and ordinances as just as this entire law which I'm setting before you today? In other words, the whole situation that God gave Israel was more than just a law code. It was part of that missionary dimension where Israel would be representing the one true God to the nations. And one of the big ways that would happen would be through this whole covenant relationship they had with him, and the stipulations of the covenant. The law code would be reflecting the justice and the righteousness and the care of God for his people. And so just before we actually get into the book of Deuteronomy, I just want to draw your attention to the structure. Because as people found these artifacts in archaeology, which were these law codes, as they studied them, as they found the structure that was related to them, what they also discovered is that the book of Deuteronomy has a very similar structure. For example, the first 5 verses would reflect the preamble, where the author is introduced. It begins, of course, by talking about Moses, but then it goes on to say that Moses is speaking all of the words that the Lord had commanded him. So although Moses is doing the speaking, these words are actually the words of Yahweh, the covenant God of Israel. And then in chapter 1 verse 6, we move into a historical prologue. And all the way through to chapter 4 verse 43, we have different dimensions of the circumstances that led up to this particular moment of the renewal of the covenant. And we will explore together what is included in that, but they have been carefully selected dimensions of that history of Israel and God to create a platform for about what was to happen, and that is Israel moving in to the promised land. And so we have the historical prologue. And then in 4:44 to the end of chapter 26, we have what is known as covenant stipulations. Now, in these treaties, often the stipulations are broken into general stipulations and then detailed stipulations. And that's what we have. 4:44 to the end of 11 are general principles. You have Moses there laying the foundations as to why Israel should keep the covenant. And you have the 10 commandments, which are the 10 big ones, general principles, which are worked out later on in the specific stipulations, as we will see. And we have other exhortations which are more of a general nature. Come to chapter 12, then you get more details, which of course we will explore too. And then we have the blessings and the curses. This is Deuteronomy 27 all the way to the end of chapter 30, but particularly chapter 28, where you have the blessings and the curses. And as we would discover, so much of Israel's subsequent history is actually recorded in that particular chapter. And then finally, we have covenant continuity. We find Joshua being commissioned. We find Moses given a song which is going to be a testimony for future generations. And then, of course, we have the blessing of Moses over the different tribes with that last chapter of a recording of Moses' death. Now, I'm not going to take a lot of time to talk about the authorship of Deuteronomy. There's so much that is written on that. I think a lot of it has been believed over the years, but now more and more scholars are rejecting Deuteronomy as being a late document. I have the conviction that this did mostly come from Moses. It was at the time of the Exodus. It was there in the wilderness. And but of course the last chapter, that was a postscript written by some other scribe at a later date to finish the book. To me, as I've looked at this, I think there's strong evidence of the Mosaic authorship of Deuteronomy. And so we have the structure of Deuteronomy that's completely keeping and in line with the suzerainty covenants. They just this match. But I want to say also that I do think there's something more going on, and I've mentioned this actually already. Before the covenants were found in archaeology, these treaties, when people looked at Deuteronomy, they weren't aware of all of this. And what they saw were Moses preaching his heart out. And I still think that this is part of Deuteronomy. But often people would say there were 3 different sermons that Moses preached. Chapter 1 through the end of chapter 4, and then 5 through 28, and then the last part. And I think that there's something in this, because what we have here is not simply a law code. As you read it, you can read of the passion of Moses, his heart reaching out to the people, longing that they would obey the Lord, longing that they would be able to be obedient and prosper. And so it's as if Moses is speaking to this new generation who are about to do the thing the previous generation failed to do, and he's longing that they would succeed, longing that as they settle the land, they would be able to prosper for many, many generations. And so it reminds me of Jesus' upper room discourse in John 13 through 16, when he's talking to the disciples before he was about to face the cross. Or maybe 2 Timothy, where Paul is talking to his son in the faith before he knows that he's going to be executed. I guess similar to 2 Peter. It's his last testimony of these people before they are going to pass on. And when you come to Deuteronomy, we find that the word here is around about 50 times, as Moses in his passion is saying, Israel, listen, hear what I'm saying. 177 times you get the words do, obey, or keep the law. So the real emphasis there of keeping the law. And then this lovely phrase comes a few times, remember and do not forget. And so you see Moses, don't miss that. Don't miss the passion. Don't miss the heart of Moses as he is restating the covenant and giving this new generation an opportunity to renew the covenant that their parents had made at Sinai. Don't miss that it's more than just a cold clinical document, but something filled with passion. And Moses, I believe, is expressing the heart of God. That's the big thing. He's expressing the heart of God, that this people would obey him. Because if they obey him, there's no end of blessing and safety and prospering that would come to them. Just to say that Deuteronomy is the foundation of the rest of the Old Testament history. Because you see, everything that Israel does is related back to this covenant. This covenant is a foundation. When Israel kept the covenant, they were safe and they prospered. You see this in Judges. You see this in Samuel and Kings. When they disobeyed the covenant, so the curses, the disciplines of the covenant were upon them. The discipline of famine, the discipline of being overrun by their enemies, the discipline of plagues or pestilence. These things would come upon them. And when they repented, then that changed. And sadly, ultimately, they lost the land. But it wasn't before the prophets came. And when the prophets came, they were in contemporary language restating the stipulations of the covenant. They were reminding people of the consequences of disobedience, and they were bringing that into a very contemporary situation. And so when it comes to the historical portion, the prophets, we find that these are rooted in this covenant, in the book of Deuteronomy. And so this now sets us up nicely where we can begin to look at the book of Deuteronomy itself.